4 people borrowed the same library book. Within 7 days, all 4 were dead. Heart attack, stroke, overdose, accident. The police saw coincidence. The librarian saw a pattern. And Nero Wolfe saw murder, because in this library, knowledge isn't power, it's a death sentence? Let's dive into this interesting mystery. Asterisk, it was a Monday in early December, and Nero Wolfe was in the kind of sublime contentment that comes from having recently consumed Fritz Brenner's Castellet and having for uninterrupted hours ahead of him to read about Byzantine architecture while drinking beer. He was in his oversized chair behind his desk, working through his first bottle of the afternoon, and radiating the satisfaction of a man whose world was ordered exactly as it should be. I was at my desk near the door, updating our files and trying to calculate how long we could maintain this peaceful existence before the bank account demanded we take on a new client. My calculations suggested we had maybe 3 weeks if Wolfe didn't buy any more rare books, which meant we had maybe 3 days because Wolfe's relationship with rare book dealers was like a sailor's relationship with shore love, expensive, frequent, and impossible to prevent. The doorbell rang at 2:43, which was not quite as offensive as a call during Wolfe's sacred orchid time, but still unwelcome enough that he didn't bother looking up from his book. "No," he said. "I haven't even checked who it is." "I don't care who it is. The answer's no. It might be Publishers Clearinghouse with an oversized check." Publishers Clearinghouse does not make house calls, Archie. Even if they did, I wouldn't want to meet them. Human interaction is exhausting. The doorbell rang again, 3 short rings in quick succession, the kind that suggested either urgency or someone who didn't understand that Nero Wolfe's schedule was sacred. I went to the hall and looked through the one-way glass panel in the door. Standing on our stoop was a woman in her mid-50s, dressed in a wool coat and sensible shoes, with gray hair pulled back in a librarian's bun and the kind of face that suggested she'd spent decades telling people to be quiet and actually expected them to listen. I went back to the office. Woman 50s, looks like she's about to find someone for an overdue book, and has the expression of someone who's discovered a murder in the reference section. Librarians do not discover murders. They discover misfiled books and loud patrons. This one looks different, also determined. If I don't let her in, she'll probably organize a protest outside with properly formatted signs. Wolfe sighed, the deep, martyred sigh of a man who knows he's about to lose an argument and has already begun calculating how to make the other person pay for winning. 5 minutes. If she cannot articulate a coherent problem in 5 minutes, you will escort her to the nearest library and leave her there. I opened the door. The woman looked at me with the sharp, assessing gaze of someone who's spent decades evaluating people based on whether they return books on time. "Mr. Goodwin, I'm Margaret Fletcher, head librarian at the Bancroft Memorial Library. I need to speak with Mr. Wolfe about a murder." "For murders, actually. Possibly a 5th if we don't act quickly." "For murders? That's ambitious." "That's desperate, Mr. Goodwin. May I come in?" "A letter to the office." Wolfe had put away his book with the air of a man surrendering a precious treasure to barbarians, and was sitting with his hands interlaced over his middle, looking like a Buddha, contemplating the fundamental inadequacy of the universe. "Miss Fletcher," I said, "this is Nero Wolfe." She sat in the red leather chair with the posture of someone who'd spent a lifetime telling people to sit up straight. "Mr. Wolfe, I'm here because people are dying, and I believe it's connected to my library. For people in the past 3 months, all found dead in their homes, all from apparent natural causes. But I don't believe they're natural. I believe someone is killing them. And I believe the next victim will die within the next 48 hours unless you can stop it." Wolfe's eyebrows rose approximately 1/16 of an inch. "For deaths from natural causes? What makes you believe they're murders?" "Because all 4 victims borrowed the same book from my library in the week before they died, and because a 5th person just checked out that same book this morning." "What book?" "The Art of Memory" by Francis Yates. It's an academic text about mnemonic techniques from the Renaissance. Not exactly popular reading. In the past 5 years, it's been checked out exactly 5 times. 4 of those borrowers are now dead. The 5th borrowed it 8 hours ago. Wolfe leaned forward slightly, which for him was equivalent to jumping out of his chair in excitement. What were the causes of death? The first, Howard Brennan, age 67, died of a heart attack 2 months ago. The second, Dallas Morrison, age 50, died of a stroke 6 weeks ago. The third, Drobert Chen, age 70, died of respiratory failure 3 weeks ago. The fourth, Sarah Kemper, age 49, died of an apparent overdose of sleeping pills 10 days ago. All ruled as natural deaths or accidents. But Mr. Wolf, they all borrowed that book within a week of dying. Coincidence is not causation, Miss Fletcher. I know that. I'm a librarian, Mr. Wolf. I understand research methodology and the difference between correlation and causation, but I also understand patterns, and this is a pattern. She opened her purse and pulled out a stack of checkout cards. These are the records. Howard Brennan checked out the book on September 15th, died on September 22nd. Alice Morrison checked it out on October 3rd, died on October 10th. Robert Chen checked it out on October 24th, died on October 31st. Sarah Kemper checked it out on November 18th, died on November 25th. Each person had the book for exactly 7 days before dying. And the fifth borrower? Daniel Foster, age 56, retired accountant, lives alone in Murray Hill. Checked out the book this morning at 9 o'clock. If the pattern holds, he'll be dead by next Monday. Wolf poured beer with deliberate slowness, buying himself time to think. Miss Fletcher, assuming for the moment that your theory has merit, how would a book kill someone? I don't know. That's why I'm here. But I've examined the book thoroughly. There's nothing obviously dangerous about it. No poison on the pages. No toxic ink. Nothing that would cause immediate harm. But something about that book is connected to these deaths. Have you contacted the police? They laughed at me. Said I was imagining things, that people die of natural causes all the time, that a shared library book is not evidence of murder. One detective suggested I'd been reading too many mystery novels. Her jaw tightened on imagining things. Mr. Wolf, I'm a professional researcher with 40 years of experience identifying patterns and verifying information. These deaths are connected. And if you don't help me, Daniel Foster will be the 5th victim. Wolf studied her for a long moment. Miss Fletcher, what is your relationship to the victims? I knew them all as library patrons. Howard Brennan came in twice a week for 40 years. Alice Morrison volunteered at our children's reading program. Robert Chen donated extensively to our collection. Sarah Kemper was researching her family. Genealogy. They were good people, Mr. Wolf. Quiet, intelligent, dedicated readers, and now they're dead. Did they know each other? Not as far as I know. Different ages, different backgrounds, different interests. The only thing they had in common was borrowing that specific book. And why would someone kill library patrons? I don't know. But I know it's happening. I know that if we don't find out why, Daniel Foster will die. She stood up. Mr. Wolf, my salary is modest. I can't afford your usual rates. But I can. Pay something. If money isn't sufficient motivation, perhaps preventing a 5th murder might be. Wolf closed his eyes. For a long moment he sat perfectly still, and I knew he was weighing the irritation of getting involved against the irritation of knowing someone was committing elaborate murders and getting away with it. Finally, he opened his eyes and said, "My fee is $100 per day plus expenses. Given your financial situation, I'll accept a retainer of $200. If we prevent this murder, you may pay the balance in installments." We don't. He paused. If we don't, then there will be no balance to pay. Margaret Fletcher pulled out her checkbook with hands that shook slightly. Thank you, Mr. Wolf. Thank you. After she left, leaving behind a check, a stack of library records, and the distinct smell of old books and determination, I looked at Wolf and said, "You don't actually believe a book is killing people. No. But I believe someone is using that book as either a weapon or a marker. And I believe we have approximately 48 hours to determine which before Mr. Daniel Foster joins the other victims." He opened his eyes. "Archie, I need you to do 3 things. First, visit the library and examine this allegedly deadly book. Second, visit Daniel Foster and determine if he's in any immediate danger. Third, obtain the autopsy reports for all. for victims and look for anything the medical examiners might have missed. And what will you be doing? I will be thinking about how someone could use a book to commit for perfect murders, and how we can prevent a fifth. The Bancroft Memorial Library was one of those grand old buildings that made you believe civilization might actually survive. Marble columns, vaulted ceilings, and the kind of respectful silence that comes from people who actually care about knowledge instead of just pretending to on social media that wouldn't be invented for another 60 years. I found Margaret Fletcher at the main desk, cataloging returns with the precision of a surgeon. When she saw me, she nodded toward a side room. The book is in my office. I pulled it from circulation this morning after Mr. Foster checked it out. I made a copy of it first photostat so he has something to read. But I wanted you to examine the original. Her office was small, neat, and smelled like old paper and discipline. On her desk sat a dark blue book, cloth-bound, about 300 pages. The Art of Memory by Francis Yates. I picked it up carefully, half expecting it to explode or emit poison gas. It didn't. It was just a book. I flipped through it, examining each page. Academic text, dense with footnotes, illustrations of memory palaces and mnemonic devices. Nothing obviously dangerous. There's no powder between the pages, no strange substances on the cover. No hidden compartments, I told you, Margaret said. There's nothing physically wrong with it. Before people read this book and died within a week, maybe they died of boredom. It's pretty dry reading. Mr. Goodwin, I'm a librarian. I understand dry reading. This is specialized academic material about Renaissance memory techniques. It's not exciting, but it's not deadly. And what's the connection? That's what Mr. Wolf needs to determine. She pulled out a file. I made copies of all the relevant checkout records, along with what I know about each victim. Howard Brennan was a retired history professor. Alice Morrison was a retired teacher. Robert Chen was a doctor. Sarah Kemper was a journalist. It's all intelligent, educated people who would have been interested in this kind of material. Did any of them know each other? I've been researching that. As far as I can tell, no. Different. Social circles, different professions, different neighborhoods. The only connection is my library and that book. I pocketed the file. I need to visit Daniel Foster. What can you tell me about him? Retired accountant, as I said. Quiet man comes in twice a week, reads mostly history and biography. When he checked out the book this morning, I tried to warn him. Told him for previous borrowers had died. You know what he said? What? He said, well, we all die eventually, Miss Fletcher. Might as well die educated. Then he smiled and left. She looked at me with eyes that had seen too much loss in two. Short a time, Mr. Goodwin. Please save him. Can't lose another patron. Daniel Foster lived in a brownstone apartment in Murray Hill, 3rd floor, with stairs that creaked and a hallway that smelled like someone's grandmother had been cooking pot roast since 1947. He answered the door in a cardigan and reading glasses, holding the photostat copy of The Art of Memory and looking mildly annoyed at being interrupted. Mr. Foster, I'm Archie Goodwin. I work for Nero Wolfe. We need to talk about the book you borrowed this morning. The librarian sent you. Really? This is getting ridiculous. I'm a grown man. I can read whatever I want. For people who read that book are dead. For people who read that book died of natural causes at ages when natural death is not uncommon. Correlation is not causation, Mr. Goodwin. I learned that in my first statistics class. May I come in? Okay. He sighed, but stepped back. His apartment was neat, organized, filled with books, and the kind of quiet that comes from living alone for a very long time. The photostat copy of the memory book was on his coffee table, bookmarked about 50 pages in. Mr. Foster, what made? You want to read about Renaissance memory techniques? I'm writing a memoir. Nothing exciting. Just stories from my career. Observations about how the accounting profession has changed. I'm 66 years old, Mr. Goodwin. My memory isn't what it used to be. I thought learning some mnemonic techniques might help me remember details more clearly. The 4 previous borrowers, did you know any of them? I knew Howard Brennan slightly. We both volunteered at the Historical Society, but I didn't know the others. What did you and Howard discuss? History, mostly. Howard was passionate about. Local New York history. We talk about old buildings, neighborhood changes, that sort of thing. When did you last see him? About a week before he died. We had coffee. He seemed fine, healthy, energetic, making plans for a research trip to the archives, and then he died of a heart attack. Yes, tragic, but not suspicious. Howard was 67, overweight, didn't exercise. Heart attacks happen. I pulled out my notebook. Mr. Foster, I need to ask, have you noticed anything unusual since you started reading this book? Strange visitors? Odd phone calls? Anything that seemed out of place? No, nothing? I borrowed the book at 9 this morning, came home, made lunch, and started reading. The only interruption has been you. How much have you read? About 50 pages. It's fascinating, actually. The techniques these Renaissance scholars used to memorize vast amounts of information, visualizing elaborate mental palaces, associating images with concepts. Quite brilliant. Mr. Foster, I'm going to be direct with you. Nero Wolfe believes someone is using that book to identify and murder people. We don't know how or why yet, but we believe you're in danger. He smiled, not mockery, but genuine amusement. Mr. Goodwin, I'm a retired accountant who lives alone and reads books about memory techniques. I'm not important enough for anyone. To murder, the other 4 victims weren't important either. They were just people who borrowed a library book. And perhaps the book really is cursed. Perhaps there's a literary demon that kills anyone who dares to read about memory palaces. He saw my expression. I'm joking, Mr. Goodwin. I appreciate your concern, but I'm not going to live in fear because of a statistical coincidence. Now, if you'll excuse me, I'd like to get back to my reading. I left him there, determined and doomed, and headed back to report to Wolfe. Back at the brownstone. Wolfe was in his chair with a pile of photostated autopsy reports spread across his desk, looking like a man who'd just discovered that the universe was even more irritating than he'd previously believed. The autopsy reports confirm what Miss Fletcher said, he announced before I could even sit down. Howard Brennan died of myocardial infarction heart attack. Alice Morrison died of a cerebral hemorrhage stroke. Robert Chen died of respiratory failure consistent with pneumonia. Sarah Kemper died of barbiturate overdose, ruled accidental. All perfectly natural or explicable deaths for people in their age ranges. So no evidence of murder, no evidence of obvious murder. But the timing. Archie within 7 days of borrowing that book, that's not coincidence. That's methodology. He leaned back. Did you examine the book? Nothing unusual, just academic text about memory techniques. Daniel Foster is reading it right now and refuses to take the threat seriously. He thinks it's statistical coincidence. What did you think of him? Smart, stubborn, living alone, writing a memoir. Knew one of the victims, Howard Brennan, from the Historical Society. Says Brennan seemed healthy a week before he died. Wolfe's eyes opened. The Historical Society. What did they discuss? I checked my notes. Local New York history, old buildings, neighborhood changes. Why? Because historians and accountants and doctors and teachers and journalists all research things, Archie. They look into records, ask questions, discover information. What if these people weren't killed because they borrowed a book, but because they knew something? What if the book is simply how the killer identified them? Identified them as what? As threats. As people who discovered something dangerous. He picked up the library records. Miss Fletcher said the book is about mnemonic techniques, methods of remembering. What if someone is killing people who remember something they shouldn't? That's pretty thin, Wolfe. It's a hypothesis. We need data. He gestured at the phone. Call Inspector Kramer. Ask him if there were any ongoing investigations connected to any of the 4 victims. Any connection to unsolved crimes, missing persons, anything that might explain why someone would want them dead. I called. Was out, but his sergeant promised to check the records and call back. While we waited, Wolfe sat with his eyes closed, fingers drumming slowly on his chair arm. The gesture that meant his brain was working through possibilities at a speed that would give most people headaches. The phone rang. 15 minutes later, it was Kramer, and he sounded curious. Goodwin? Why are you asking about 4 people who died of natural causes? We think they might have been murdered. Based on what? Based on them all borrowing the same library book within a week of dying? Silence. Then, have you been drinking wolf's beer? Because that's the stupidest theory I've heard all year. Just answer the question, Inspector. Were any of them connected to investigations? More silence. Then, grudgingly, funny you should. Ask Howard Brennan had contacted us 2 months ago about some historical research he was doing. Said he'd found irregularities in property records from the 1920s. We told him to take it to the DA's office if he had evidence of fraud. He never followed up. What kind of irregularities? Properties that were seized during Prohibition speakeasies. Warehouses. Some of them were never properly returned to their original owners. Brennan thought there might have been corruption in the redistribution process. I reported this to Wolf, who smiled a small, satisfied smile that meant something had just clicked. Property fraud from the 1920s, 25 years ago. Records that someone thought were safely buried. And then, a retired history professor starts digging them up. Archie, find out what properties Howard Brennan was researching. Find out who currently owns them. And find out if any of the other victims had any connection to real estate, property records, or historical research into Prohibition-era New York. You think someone's killing people to cover up old property fraud? I think someone's killing people who got too close to discovering that's certain. Valuable Manhattan properties were stolen a quarter-century ago. I think they're using a library book about memory techniques to identify which researchers are dangerous to them. He leaned forward. The question is, how are they killing people in ways that look like natural death? And how do we stop them before Daniel Foster becomes victim number 5? Tuesday morning I spent at the Hall of Records, digging through property. Files from the 1920s and trying not to sneeze from dust that was older than most people's grandparents. What I found was exactly what Wolf had predicted. Trail of suspicious property transfers that led from speakeasies and bootlegging. Warehouses seized during Prohibition to current ownership by various shell companies and holding corporations. Howard Brennan had been thorough. His research notes, which his widow had given me with tears in her eyes and questions I couldn't answer, showed a pattern. At least 15 properties had been seized by the city between 1925 and 1933, supposedly, to be returned to their original owners after Prohibition ended, but instead they'd been quietly transferred to new ownership through a series of bureaucratic maneuvers that looked legal but smelled rotten. The properties were now worth millions. Prime Manhattan real estate that had been stolen through paperwork and patience. I reported this to Wolf over lunch while he worked through Fritz's cock oven and looked like a man who just confirmed his worst suspicions about human nature. 15 properties, he said, collectively worth perhaps $10 million in current market value. Someone orchestrated a systematic theft using the chaos of Prohibition and the complexity of municipal records. And they've been sitting on that wealth for 25 years, hoping no one would notice, until Howard Brennan started researching local history. Precisely. And once Brennan started asking questions, someone realized the fraud might be exposed, so they killed him, made it look like a heart attack. Problem solved, except then Alice. Morrison borrowed the same book, which suggests Alice Morrison was also researching the same topic. What did you learn about her? I pulled out my notes. Alice Morrison was a retired teacher who volunteered at the library's genealogy program. According to Margaret Fletcher, Alice was helping people trace their family histories and property ownership. 3 months ago, she was helping someone research their grandfather's property that was seized during Prohibition. Whose grandfather? A man named Thomas Chin, son of Robert Chen, victim number 3. Wolf's eyebrows climbed. Robert Chen, the doctor who died of respiratory failure? His father lost property during Prohibition. A warehouse in Chinatown, seized in 1927, supposedly for storing illegal alcohol. Except according to Alice Morrison's research notes, the warehouse was actually being used as a community center and had nothing to do with bootlegging. The seizure was fraudulent, and Alice Morrison discovered this. She discovered it and documented it. Then she borrowed a book about memory techniques, probably to help organize all the historical data she was gathering, and within a week she died of a stroke. Which brings us to Robert Chen himself. What was he researching? According to His medical practice administrator, Dr. Chin, had been asking questions about his father's property for months, trying to find legal recourse to reclaim it. He'd even hired a lawyer to look into it, who then presumably told him the case was too old, the records too complex, the chance of success too small. Exactly. So Dr. Chen decided to research it. Himself borrowed the memory book to help him organize his findings, and died of respiratory failure 10 days later. Wolf leaned back, and Sarah Kemper, the journalist. I talked to her editor at the Tribune. Sarah had been working on a story about historical property fraud in Manhattan. She'd interviewed Howard Brennan 2 weeks before he died. He was her primary source. After Brennan died, she kept investigating. Borrowed the same book he'd used, presumably to understand his research methods. Died of a sleeping pill overdose a week later. Ruled accidental. The police found pills and alcohol in her system. It's easy to stage if someone has access to her apartment. Wolf poured beer with deliberate precision. So we have a pattern. Howard. Brennan discovers the fraud, starts researching, borrows a book, dies. Alice Morrison continues researching the same fraud, borrows the same book, dies. Robert Chen investigates his father's stolen property, borrows the same book, dies. Sarah Kemper investigates the story, borrows the same book, dies. And now Daniel Foster, who knew Howard Brennan from the Historical Society, is writing a memoir that might include historical research. Who borrowed the same book yesterday? The killer is watching the library, Wolf said quietly, monitoring who checks out that specific book, using it as an early warning system to identify people who might be researching the property fraud, then eliminating them before they can expose the theft. But how? How are they killing people in ways that look like natural death? That, Archie, is what we need to determine, and we need to determine it quickly, because Daniel Foster has approximately 36 hours before the pattern suggests he'll join the other victims. The phone rang. It was Margaret Fletcher, and her voice had the shaky quality of someone trying very hard not to scream. Mr. Goodwin, something's happened. Someone broke into the library last night. They didn't take anything valuable. Not the rare books, not the cash box. They only took one thing. Let me guess. The original copy of The Art of Memory? Yes. How did you know? Because the killer realized we were investigating. They want to eliminate the evidence. Do you still have the checkout records? I do, and I've made copies and locked the originals in my safe deposit box. But Mr. Goodwin, if they broke into the library to steal the book, it's to stop them from she didn't finish the sentence, but she didn't need to. From killing you too, I said. Miss Fletcher, I think you should close the library for a few days. Tell your staff it's for renovations or fumigation or whatever librarians tell people. And don't go home alone tonight. After I hung up, Wolf said the killer is accelerating. They know we're investigating. They've stolen the book to eliminate evidence, and they'll likely move against Daniel Foster sooner rather than later. So what do? We set a trap. We use Mr. Foster as bait. We catch a killer who's been hiding behind paperwork and poison for 25 years. Foster won't agree to be bait, and we don't tell him. We simply watch him very carefully and wait for the killer to make their move. Wolf opened his eyes. Archie, I need you to maintain surveillance on Daniel Foster's apartment tonight. Don't let anyone in or out without noting it. Someone tries to harm him, stop them. And if you can capture them alive, all the better. And if I can't, then we'll have one less murderer in the world and one more difficult conversation with Inspector Kramer. He picked up the phone. But first, I'm calling Saul Panzer. We need another set of eyes on this. Someone's been killing researchers for months, and they're very good at making it look natural. We need to be better. Tuesday evening, I was parked across the street from Daniel Foster's apartment building, drinking bad coffee from a thermos and watching windows that revealed nothing more interesting than an old man reading a book that might get him killed. Saul. Panzer was covering the back entrance, and we had a signal system worked out one short whistle if anyone suspicious entered the building. It's whistles if we needed backup. So far, nothing. Just normal Murray Hill evening activity. People coming. Home from work, walking dogs, living their ordinary lives while a killer planned extraordinary things. At 8:47, something changed. A man in a dark overcoat and hat entered the building through the front entrance. Nothing obviously suspicious about him. He could have been any resident coming home. But something about the way he moved, the way he checked the mailboxes without actually looking at them, made my instincts perk up. I whistled one short, sharp, so I would be alert now. The man disappeared up the stairs. I gave him 2 minutes, then followed, keeping my footsteps quiet on the creaky stairs. By the time I reached the 3rd floor, the man in the overcoat was knocking on Daniel Foster's door. Foster opened it. "Yes, Mr. Foster. I'm Detective Williams, NYPD. I need to ask you a few questions about Howard Brennan's death." My hand went to the gun in my shoulder holster. There was no Detective Williams on Kramer's squad. I'd memorized the roster years ago. Foster, bless his trusting heart, stepped back to let the fake detective in. "Of course. Come in." I moved fast, got to the door before it closed, pushed my way in behind the fake detective. "Hugh, are you really?" The man spun, and I saw his face clearly for the first time. Mid-40s, unremarkable features. The kind of face you'd forget 2 minutes after seeing it, which was probably the point. "I'm a police detective," he said, but his hand was moving toward his coat pocket. "Don't." I had my gun out now, pointed at his center mass, and where I can see them. Slowly. He complied, raising his hands. Foster stood frozen, looking between us like he'd suddenly realized he'd stepped into a situation he didn't understand. "Mr. Goodwin," Foster said. "What's going on? This man isn't a detective. He's probably the person who's been killing library patrons." I gestured with my gun. "Empty your pockets, carefully." The man hesitated, then slowly pulled items from his coat wallet, keys and a small glass vial filled with clear liquid. "What's in the vial?" I asked. "Medicine? For what? My heart condition?" "You're lying." "Daniel, call the police." "Real police." Inspector Kramer. The man moved. Fast. Threw the vial at my face. I ducked. Heard glass shatter against the wall behind me. Smelled something sharp and chemical. The man bolted for the door. I went after him, but my vision was blurring. Whatever had been in that vial, the fumes alone were enough to make my head swim. I made it to the hallway, saw the man disappearing down the stairs, tried to follow. Legs weren't cooperating. Saul Panzer appeared from nowhere, saw me swaying, understood immediately. "I've got him. Sit down before you fall down." I sat. The world tilted sideways. Through the fog in my head, I heard whistles, shouts, running footsteps. Then nothing. I woke up in Daniel Foster's apartment with a paramedic shining a light in my eyes and Saul Panzer explaining to Inspector Kramer that yes, we had been conducting unauthorized surveillance.
Oh.
And no, we hadn't caught the killer. But we'd confirmed he existed and he was definitely trying to kill people. "What was in the vial?" I asked, my voice sounding like it belonged to someone else. "Chloroform mixed with something else. The lab's still analyzing it," Kramer said. "Enough to knock you out for a few minutes, if you'd gotten it directly in. Your face, instead of breaking the vial on the wall, you'd have been unconscious before you hit the floor." "Did Saul catch him?" "He got away. Disappeared into the subway. But we got a description, and we're looking." Kramer pulled up a chair and sat down heavily. "All right, Goodwin. Tell me everything, and I mean everything. For dead people, a library book, and property fraud from the 1920s? Start talking." I talked. Told him about the pattern, the research, the stolen properties, the killer monitoring library checkouts. When I finished, Kramer looked like a man who'd just been told the world was even more complicated than he'd thought. And he'd thought it was pretty complicated already. "So someone's been killing researchers to cover up a property theft from 25 years ago? That's Wolf's theory." "And you believe it?" "I believe someone just tried to knock me out with chloroform disguised as a police detective. That's evidence enough for me." Kramer stood up. "I'm posting guards on Foster, and I'm reopening investigations into all 4 deaths.
Yeah.
If Wolf's right, and God help me, he usually is, then we've got 4 murders that were ruled natural deaths, and a killer who's very good at making poison look like heart attacks and strokes. How do you poison someone to cause a heart attack?" There are ways digitalis overdose can cause cardiac arrest. Certain toxins can cause strokes. If you know someone's medical history, you can exploit their weaknesses. Induce respiratory failure in someone with lung problems, overdose someone who takes sleeping pills. He looked at Foster, who was sitting pale and shaking on his couch. Mr. Foster, you're coming with me. Protective custody until we catch this bastard. But my apartment will be here when you get back. If you go home now, you won't be. Kramer gestured to his officers. Let's move. After they left, I called the brownstone. Wolf answered on the second ring. The killer made his move, I said. Tried to use chloroform on me. Got away. But we confirmed your theory. He's real, he's dangerous, and he's actively trying to kill Daniel Foster. Did you see his face? Mid-40s, average height, unremarkable features. The kind of man you'd walk past on the street and never remember? Perfect for a long-term criminal operation. What about the vial he threw at you? Chloroform mixed with something else. Lab's analyzing it. Archie, I want you to come home now. We need to reassess. The killer knows we're onto him, knows Foster. Is protected, and will likely change tactics. We need to anticipate his next move. What next move? Foster's in protective custody. The killer can't get to him, can't he? Archie, this killer has successfully murdered 4 people over 3 months and made every death look natural. He's patient, methodical, and very clever. Putting Foster in protective custody won't stop him. Will merely force him to be more creative. Wolf paused. Come home. We need to think. Back at the brownstone, Wolf was in his chair with the library checkout records spread across his desk, studying them with the expression of a man who just noticed something everyone else had missed. Archie, look at these dates. Now look. The 4 victims had borrowed the book on specific dates: September 15th, October 3rd, October 24th, November 18th. Daniel Foster had borrowed it December 4th. What am I looking for? The intervals. 18 days between Brennan and Morrison. 21 days between Morrison and Chen. 25 days between Chen and Kemper. 16 days between Kemper and Foster. He looked up. The killer isn't monitoring the library randomly. He has a system. He checks the records on a regular schedule, probably every 2 to 3 weeks. When he sees someone has borrowed the book, he investigates. If that person is researching the property fraud, he eliminates them, so he's connected to the library. Somehow has access to checkout records. Or he has a confederate who does. Someone who works at the library who can check the records regularly without arousing suspicion. My stomach dropped. Margaret Fletcher. No, Miss Fletcher brought the pattern to our attention. If she were the killer or his accomplice, she'd have simply destroyed the records and continued killing quietly. But someone at that library has been feeding information to our killer. He picked up the phone. Call Miss Fletcher. Ask her who has regular access to checkout records besides herself. I called. Margaret answered on the first ring, her voice tight with stress. Mr. Goodwin, have you caught him? Not yet. I need to ask you a question. Who else has access to your checkout records, besides me? My assistant librarian, Thomas Morrison. And the volunteers who help with returns and cataloging there are usually 3 or 4 of them, though they rotate. Is Thomas Morrison? Any relation to Alice Morrison? Yes, her son? He started working at the library after she died. Said he wanted to honor her memory by continuing her work. Her voice changed. God, you don't think I think we need to talk to Thomas Morrison? Is he at the library now? No, he left early today. Said he had a family matter to attend to. I haven't seen him since this morning. Where does he live? She gave me an address in Queens. I thanked her and hung up, then looked at Wolf. Thomas Morrison, Alice Morrison's son, has been working at the library, has access to all checkout records, and he left early today, right around the time someone tried to kill Daniel Foster. Call Inspector Kramer. Tell him we've identified a suspect. Tell him to pick up Thomas Morrison immediately for questioning. I made the call. Kramer dispatched units to Morrison's address. While we waited, Wolf sat with his eyes closed, thinking. It's not just about covering up the property theft anymore, he said quietly. Thomas Morrison's mother was killed because she was helping Robert Chen research his father's stolen property. Morrison discovered who killed her, discovered the whole property fraud scheme, and decided to continue the killing himself. Not to protect the property theft, to avenge his mother by ensuring everyone else who got close to the truth shared her fate. That's revenge and murder compounded. It's human nature at its worst, Archie. Grief twisted into rage, rage channeled into methodical killing. Thomas Morrison became the very thing that destroyed his mother, a murderer hiding behind natural-looking deaths. The phone rang. Kramer. We found Morrison, dead. Suicide. Looks like he took the same poison he'd been using on his victims. Left a note confessing to everything: the killings, the property research, all of it. Case closed. Except it wasn't. Because when I repeated this to Wolf, he opened his eyes and said one word that changed everything. No, no, I repeated. Do you mean no? Morrison's dead, left a confession, case closed. The killer killed himself. The killer is not dead, Archie. Thomas Morrison was murdered. How can you possibly know that? Because Thomas Morrison had no reason to kill himself. Now, if he were truly the killer, he'd succeeded in eliminating 4 victims over 3 months without arousing suspicion. We only identified him hours ago. Not enough time for us to have approached him, questioned him, or pressured him.
I would.
He suddenly commits suicide when he could simply disappear, leave town, abandon his library position, and escape investigation entirely. Maybe he panicked. Methodical killers who successfully commit 4 murders over 3 months do not panic. Archie, they adapt. Morrison's supposed suicide is too convenient. It appears exactly when we're closing in on the truth, providing a neat resolution that prevents further investigation. Wolf leaned forward. Someone killed Thomas Morrison and staged it to look like suicide with a confession. The same someone who's been killing researchers for months. Then who? Someone who knew we'd identified Morrison as a suspect. Someone who needed Morrison's silence before he could tell us what he actually knew. Someone with access to the same library records, the same opportunities, the same knowledge of the victims. He picked up the phone. Call Inspector Kramer. Tell him to treat Morrison's death as a homicide, not suicide. And tell him to check that confession note very carefully for authenticity. I made the call. Kramer was skeptical, but agreed to have his handwriting expert examine the note. While we waited, Wolf sat with his eyes closed and his fingers drumming on the chair arm. Archie, who else works at the Bancroft Library? Margaret Fletcher, the head librarian. Thomas Morrison, her assistant. And volunteers who wrote a Fletcher mentioned 3 or 4 of them. Get their names. Find out which volunteers have been there long enough to have access to records dating back 3 months. And find out if any of them have connections too. The stolen properties from the 1920s. I called Margaret Fletcher again. She was still shaken from learning her assistant might have been a killer or a victim. The regular volunteers, she said. Let me check my records. We have Dorothy Walsh, who's been with us for 5 years. Bernard Cooper, 3 years. Linda Hayworth, 2 years. And she paused. And Richard Kellerman. He started 6 months. I'll go right after we acquired a special collection of historical documents about Prohibition-era New York. Richard Kellerman. Relation to anyone involved in the property seizures. I don't know. But Mr. Goodwin, Richard is the one who suggested. We expand our historical archives. He's been very helpful, very knowledgeable about local history. He even donated some of his own family documents. What kind of documents? Property records, mostly. His grandfather was involved in real estate during the 1920s. Richard said he wanted to preserve the family history, or he wanted to monitor. Anyone researching his family's criminal history? Where is Richard Kellerman now? I don't know. He volunteers Tuesday and Thursday afternoons. This is Tuesday. He should have been here this afternoon, but he called in sick. I need his address. She gave it to me, Ann's apartment on the Upper West Side. I thanked her and hung up, then looked at Wolf. Richard Kellerman. Volunteer for 6 months. Grandfather in real estate during the 1920s, has access to library records. Called in sick today, the same day Morrison was killed and someone tried to attack Foster, his grandfather's name. I checked the notes for my property records research. One of the shell companies that received stolen properties was Kellerman Holdings, owned by a Samuel Kellerman, Richard Kellerman's grandfather, who stole 15 properties worth millions through fraudulent seizures, then passed them down to his descendants. And when researchers started discovering the fraud, Richard Kellerman began eliminating them. Wolf opened his eyes. Call Inspector Kramer. Tell him we need Richard Kellerman picked up immediately for questioning. Tell him Kellerman is our killer, not Thomas Morrison. And tell him to bring Kellerman here. I want to talk to him before he lawyers up and disappears into the legal system. They found Richard Kellerman at his apartment, calmly packing a suitcase. He didn't resist arrest, didn't demand a lawyer, just smiled and agreed to come to the brownstone to clear up this misunderstanding. Arrived at 7 o'clock Wednesday evening. Flanked by two of Kramer's detectives and radiating the calm confidence of a man who'd planned for every contingency. He was in his early 50s, well-dressed, distinguished-looking, with silver hair and the kind of face that suggested generations of good breeding and expensive education. Wolf studied him with the expression of a naturalist, examining a particularly interesting specimen of poisonous snake. Mr. Kellerman, you've been killing library patrons who researched your grandfather's property fraud. That's an extraordinary accusation, Mr. Wolf. Do you have evidence? I have a pattern. For deaths. All people researching Prohibition-era property seizures. All borrowing the same library book within a week of dying. All monitored by you through your volunteer position at the library. Coincidence? I volunteer at the library because I enjoy books and community service. You volunteered at the library? 6 months ago, exactly when researchers started getting close to discovering your family's theft. You've had access to checkout records, allowing you to identify which researchers were dangerous to you. You've been systematically eliminating them. Again, I'd like to see evidence. Wolf smiled, a cold, dangerous smile. Very well. Discuss evidence. Thomas Morrison was found dead this afternoon with a suicide note confessing to the murders. But that note was written on a typewriter, a library's typewriter specifically. It's the same typewriter you have access to as a volunteer. Thomas Morrison's own typewriter at home was electric-y. Wouldn't have used a manual typewriter to write. A confession. You killed him and staged the suicide to frame a convenient scapegoat. Kellerman's expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes. Furthermore, Wolf continued, you attempted to kill Daniel Foster yesterday using chloroform, the same chloroform that was used by your grandfather's generation as an anesthetic. Old-fashioned, reliable, and readily available to someone with connections to medical suppliers. You disguised yourself as a police detective, a role you could play convincingly because you've studied police procedures through your research, into how investigations might expose your family's crimes. This is all speculation, is it, Inspector? Kramer, please show Mr. Kellerman the evidence we recovered from Thomas Morrison's apartment. Kramer pulled out an evidence bag containing a small notebook. We found this hidden in Morrison's desk. It's his research notes on your grandfather's property fraud. Morrison knew everything he'd been investigating independently after his mother died. He confronted you last week, threatened to expose you. That's when you decided he had to die. Never yes you did, Wolf said quietly. Because Thomas Morrison made one critical error. He told you about his research, thinking you were a fellow history enthusiast who'd appreciate his findings. He showed you his notes, his evidence, his timeline, and you realized that if Morrison went public, your family's stolen fortune would be exposed and seized. So you killed him and staged it as the suicide of a guilty man. Kellerman stood up. I'm not saying anything else without my lawyer. Sit down, Mr. Kellerman. I'm not finished. Something in Wolf's voice made Kellerman sit. You think you've been clever? Wolf said. Killing people with poisons that mimic natural death digitalis for heart attacks, warfarin for strokes, respiratory depressants for pneumonia, sleeping pills for accidental overdose. You've studied your victims' medical histories, exploited their vulnerabilities, made each death look plausible. You think you've left no evidence? Because I haven't. Except you have. You've left the most damning evidence of all yourself. Your presence at the library, your access to records, your family connection to the stolen properties, your sudden appearance 6 months ago when the research became dangerous. And most importantly, Wolf leaned forward. Your mistake with Thomas Morrison. What mistake? Killed him too quickly? If Morrison were truly the killer, overcome with guilt, he'd have spent time agonizing over his confession, writing and rewriting it, explaining his motives in detail. But the note you typed was brief, perfunctory, lacking the emotional weight of genuine remorse. It reads like someone checking boxes, not someone unburdening their soul. Kellerman's calm facade cracked slightly. You can't prove any of this, can't we? Inspector Kramer, tell Mr. Kellerman what your forensics team found in his apartment while he was packing. Kramer smiled grimly. Vials of various pharmaceuticals. Digitalis, warfarin, chloroform, barbiturates. A collection of medical texts about poison symptoms. Research notes on all 4 victims, their medical histories, their habits, their vulnerabilities, and a ledger showing properties inherited from Samuel Kellerman, currently worth approximately $12 million. The room went very quiet finally. Kellerman said they were going to take everything. Grandfather built an empire. Your grandfather stole an empire, Wolf corrected. Through fraud, corruption, and the exploitation of Prohibition's chaos, and you've killed 4 innocent people to protect that theft. 5, if we count Thomas Morrison. They weren't innocent. Were threatening my family's legacy. They were researchers, Mr. Kellerman, people seeking truth, uncovering history, trying to right old wrongs, and you murdered them for that. Wolf's voice turned cold. Take him away, Inspector. I'm tired of looking at him. As Kramer's men led Kellerman away, still protesting, still insisting he'd done nothing wrong, Wolf sat back in his chair and closed his eyes. A library that knew too much, he murmured. Not the library itself, but the people who used it. People who trusted that knowledge was safe, that research was innocent, that discovering truth wouldn't cost them their lives. At least we saved Daniel Foster, I said. This time. But there will be other Richard Kellermans, Archie. Other people who value money over truth, who kill to protect stolen fortunes, who see researchers as threats rather than treasures. Libraries. Maybe temples of knowledge, but they're also hunting grounds for those who fear what knowledge can reveal. The next morning, I expected to be writing up invoices and closing the case. Instead, I got a phone call at 8:30 from Inspector Kramer, and his voice had the quality of a man who'd just discovered that a case he thought was solved had actually exploded in his face. Goodwin, get down to the precinct. Now, bring. Wolf, if you can drag him out of that brownstone. What happened? Richard Kellerman is dead. I felt my stomach drop.
Oh, poison?
Same stuff he used on his victim's digitalis. Looks like slipped into his morning coffee while he was in holding. We've got a dead murderer and no idea who killed him. I'll call you back. I hung up and looked at Wolf, who was at his desk, reading the morning paper and drinking coffee like the world hadn't just gotten significantly more complicated. Kellerman's dead, poisoned in his cell. Ow. Wolf's coffee cup stopped halfway to his lips. He set it down carefully. When this morning, someone got digitalis into his coffee. Who had access to him? That's what Kramer wants to know. Wolf was silent for a long moment, his eyes closed, his brain working through possibilities. Then he opened his eyes and said, "This changes everything." How? Because if Richard Kellerman is dead, then either he had an accomplice who's now tying up loose ends, or he paused, or we arrested the wrong man. We had evidence. The pharmaceuticals, the research notes, the confession he practically made. We had evidence that Richard Kellerman knew about the murders. We had evidence he was connected to the stolen properties. We had evidence he was monitoring library records. But did we actually have evidence he committed the murders himself? Wolf leaned forward. Think, Archie. Richard Kellerman was 50 years old, was in good health, financially secure, with every resource to hire the best lawyers in New York. He could have fought the charges, claimed the evidence was circumstantial, possibly even won acquittal. Why would someone poison him in custody unless he knew something that made him dangerous even in jail? Like who actually killed the 4 researchers? Precisely. Wolf stood up, which he almost never does before lunch. We're going to the precinct. Now, I need to see the crime scene. Interview everyone who had contact with Kellerman. Determine who wanted him dead badly enough to commit murder inside a police station. The precinct was chaos when we arrived. Kramer was shouting at his officers, demanding to know how someone had poisoned a prisoner in custody. Kellerman's body had been removed, but his cell was still cordoned off. The coffee cup bagged as evidence. Wolf examined the cell with the intensity of a man searching for clues in enemy territory. "Who brought him coffee?" "Officer Patterson," Kramer said. 20-year veteran, clean record, no connection to Kellerman or the case. Says he got the coffee from the break room like he always does, brought it to Kellerman's cell, watched him drink it. 10 minutes later, Kellerman collapsed, dead before the ambulance arrived. Was Officer Patterson in the break room alone? No, 3 other officers were there, and Kramer checked his notes. A visitor who was waiting to see someone in holding. What visitor? Woman named Dorothy Walsh. Said she was there too. See her son, who'd been picked up on a drunk and disorderly charge last night. We verified her son Gregory Walsh is in holding cell 3. Wolf's eyes opened wide. Gregory Walsh. The client's name was Gregory Walsh. I pulled out my notebook from the previous case. Wait. Wrong case. I was thinking of the crime without time case we'd started. But something about the name Walsh was familiar. ... double quotes the volunteers, I said suddenly. Margaret Fletcher mentioned a volunteer named Dorothy Walsh. Been at the library 5 years. Wolf turned to Kramer. Where's Dorothy Walsh now? At least after we verified her story. She visited her son, waited in the break room while we processed him, then left. And in that time, she had access to the break room where Officer Patterson's coffee was prepared. You think a library volunteer poisoned Kellerman? I think someone who knew about the murders, had access to library records, and wanted Kellerman silenced, did exactly that. Wolf's jaw tightened. Inspector, I need Dorothy Walsh's address, and I need you to pick her up immediately for questioning. Dorothy. Walsh lived in a brownstone in Brooklyn, Heights, well maintained. Expensive, with the kind of quiet dignity that comes from old money, carefully preserved. When Kramer's men brought her to the precinct 2 hours later, she was in her 60s, well-dressed. With the bearing of someone who'd spent a lifetime being respectable and wasn't about to stop now, Wolf studied her with the expression of a man who'd just recognized a predator hiding in plain sight. Mrs. Walsh, you've been volunteering at the Bancroft Library for 5 years, yes. I enjoy helping with the community. You had access to checkout records, as do all volunteers. Help patrons find books, process returns, maintain records. It's part of the job. You knew Richard Kellerman? We worked together? He was a pleasant man, very knowledgeable about history. Did you know his grandfather had stolen properties during Prohibition? She smiled a cold, precise smile. Mr. Wolf, everyone in certain circles knew about the Kellerman properties. My own father lost a warehouse in those seizures. Samuel Kellerman stole it through fraudulent paperwork, and my family never recovered financially. It's been a sore point for generations. So you had motive to want justice against the Kellerman family? Justice? Yes, but I'm a 62-year-old librarian, Mr. Wolf, not a murderer. Yet you poisoned Richard Kellerman this morning in a police station? I did no such thing. You were in the break room where Officer Patterson prepared coffee. You had access, you had opportunity, and you had motive, not just against the Kellermans, but against all the researchers who were discovering the property fraud. Because if that fraud was exposed, it would reveal that your family's lost property should be returned, but it can't be. Because it's been sold and developed and transferred too many times over 25 years, you'd get nothing. Dorothy Walsh's smile didn't waver. That's an interesting theory, Mr. Wolf, but you're missing something important. What? I didn't poison Richard Kellerman to silence him. She leaned forward. I poisoned him because he was about to confess. He'd already started talking to his lawyer about a plea deal admission of guilt in exchange for a reduced sentence. And if he confessed, he'd implicate me as his accomplice. The room went very quiet. You see, Mr. Wolf, Richard and I had an arrangement. He monitored the library records. I identified which researchers were genuinely dangerous. We both had family connections to the stolen properties, His family profited from the theft. My family was victimized by it. But we both wanted the truth buried. Richard to protect his fortune, me to prevent the painful revelation that my family's loss could never be remedied. So you've worked together to kill the researchers. Richard supplied the poisons and the knowledge of each victim's medical vulnerabilities. I gained their trust, learned their habits, administered the lethal doses. For deaths over 3 months, all perfectly natural looking. It would have continued indefinitely if that meddling librarian hadn't noticed the pattern with the book. She looked at Margaret Fletcher, who was sitting pale and shaking in the corner. You ruined everything, Margaret. If you'd just minded your own business, no one else would have died. But they did die, Wolfe said coldly. For innocent researchers. Thomas Morrison. And Richard Kellerman, your own accomplice. Richard was weak. He panicked when you identified him, started talking about confessions and plea deals. I couldn't allow that, so I eliminated the problem, just like we'd been eliminating problems all along. She smiled again. The only difference is, you can't prove I poisoned Richard. There's no evidence linking me to the digitalis. No witnesses who saw me tamper with the coffee, nothing but your theories and my word against your accusations. Actually, Kramer said, pulling out his phone, we've got your confession. Entire conversation has been recorded. Dorothy Walsh's smile finally faded. You can't. That's entrapment. That's justice, Mrs. Walsh. 4 researchers who just wanted to uncover truth. For Thomas Morrison, who wanted to avenge his mother. For Richard Kellerman, who at least had the decency to feel guilty before. You killed him. Kramer gestured to his officers. Take her away, as they led Dorothy Walsh out silent now. All her composure finally shattered. Wolfe sat back in his chair and closed his eyes. A twist in the game, he murmured. We thought we'd caught the killer. Instead, we'd caught half a partnership, and the deadlier half was still free, ready to kill to protect her secret. At least we caught her before she could kill anyone else. I said. This time Wolfe replied, but there will always be people like Dorothy Walsh, Archie, people who'd rather murder than face uncomfortable truths. People who value their own peace over other people's lives. That's the real crime, not the property fraud from 25 years ago, but the willingness to kill repeatedly to keep old crimes hidden. Back at the brownstone that evening, after the paperwork was filed and Dorothy Walsh was safely behind bars awaiting trial, Margaret Fletcher came to thank Wolfe personally. She sat in the red leather chair looking smaller and older than when she'd first arrived, carrying the weight of knowing her library had been a hunting ground. Mr. Wolfe, I don't know how to thank you. If I hadn't noticed the pattern, if I hadn't come to you, more people would have died, Wolfe finished. But you did notice, Miss Fletcher. You saw what others missed, the connection between deaths that appeared unrelated. That's the mark of a true researcher, someone who recognizes patterns in chaos. I just wish I'd noticed sooner. Before 4 people died, you noticed as soon as the pattern became visible. That's all anyone can do. He leaned back. Miss Fletcher, I have a question for you. Something that's been troubling me about this case. What is it? Why the art of memory? Why did all the researchers borrow that specific book? What made it so central to their investigation that Dorothy Walsh and Richard Kellerman used it as a marker for identifying dangerous researchers? Margaret considered. I've been thinking about that myself. The book is about Renaissance mnemonic. Techniques, methods for remembering vast amounts of information by creating mental structures called memory palaces. You visualize a building, place information in specific rooms, then walk through the building in your mind to recall the data. And the researchers use this technique? I believe so. Howard Brennan's research notes mentioned creating a mental map of property transfers. Alice Morrison talked about building memory structures to track genealogical connections. Robert Chen was organizing decades of medical and property records. Sarah Kemper was piecing together multiple sources for her journalism. They all needed ways to remember and organize complex historical data, so they borrowed a book about memory techniques to help them research property fraud. Yes, and in doing so, they inadvertently marked themselves as threats. Dorothy Walsh monitored the checkout records, saw who was borrowing the memory book, investigated what they were researching. When she found they were getting close to The truth about the Prohibition seizures, Margaret's voice broke. She killed them, used their own attempts to remember against them. Wolf was silent for a moment. Then he said, "There's a terrible irony in that, Miss Fletcher. These people borrowed a book about the art of memory, seeking to preserve and organize knowledge. Instead, they were killed by someone who wanted to ensure that certain memories, certain truths remained forgotten. The book meant to aid memory became an instrument of enforced forgetting. Will the stolen properties be returned now to their rightful owners or heirs? That's for the courts to decide. But the truth is now public, the fraud exposed. Justice follows is another question." He picked up his beer. "Miss Fletcher, your library will survive this. In fact, it may thrive. You've demonstrated that libraries aren't just repositories of books. They're battlegrounds where truth fights against those who'd suppress it. That's worth remembering." Shh. After she left, I looked at Wolf and said, "You knew it was Dorothy Walsh before we went to the precinct, didn't you?" I suspected. The name Walsh appearing as both a library volunteer and, coincidentally, in another case, suggested connections we hadn't explored. Her long tenure at the library, 5 years, gave her time to monitor records thoroughly, and her presence at the precinct at precisely the right moment to poison Kellerman was too convenient to be coincidence. "Why didn't you say something earlier?" "Because suspicion isn't evidence, Archie. I needed Dorothy Walsh to reveal herself. The recording of her confession was Inspector Kramer's idea, but I'd hoped she'd incriminate herself through pride. Killers often do. They believe they're cleverer than everyone else, and that belief makes them careless. She killed 6 people. She killed 6 people to protect a secret that would have come out anyway. Property fraud from 25 years ago might have been embarrassing to expose, might have triggered lawsuits and legal complications, but it wouldn't have destroyed her. The murders destroyed her. She traded her life and freedom for the illusion of keeping an old crime hidden." He closed his eyes. "It's the same mistake Richard Kellerman made. They both believed that killing was somehow less catastrophic than revelation. They were wrong." "What about Daniel Foster? Is he safe now?" "Mr. Foster is safe. The only people who wanted him dead are now in custody or deceased. He can finish reading his book about memory techniques and write his memoir without fear of poisoned coffee or mysterious heart attacks. And the library. The library will continue its work. Researchers will keep discovering uncomfortable truths. Some will borrow books about memory, and librarians like Margaret Fletcher will keep watching for patterns, protecting knowledge, and occasionally, when necessary, calling detectives to stop killers who fear what knowledge can reveal." 2 weeks later, I was reading the newspaper over breakfast when I came across a small article buried on page 12. Dorothy Walsh had been formally charged with 6 counts of murder. Richard Kellerman's estate, worth $12 million, was being seized by the city pending resolution of the property fraud claims. The Bancroft Memorial Library had received anonymous donations totaling $50,000. Earmarked for expanding their historical research archives, I showed the article to Wolf, who was working through his second cup of coffee and looking like a man contemplating whether to read about orchids or Byzantine architecture. "The library got $50,000, I said. "Any idea who donated it?" "None whatsoever, though I imagine someone with a guilty conscience and too much money decided that funding research was preferable to watching more researchers die. One of the Kellerman heirs? Possibly. Or someone else whose family profited from the Prohibition seizures and would prefer not to be the next target of historical investigation." He turned a page. "Either way, the money will be put to good use. Margaret Fletcher will ensure that." "What about Daniel Foster?" "Mr. Foster sent a thank you note. He's finished his memoir and dedicated it to the 4 researchers who died pursuing truth: Howard Brennan, Alice Morrison, Robert Chen, and Sarah Kemper. He calls them martyrs to the principle that knowledge matters more than comfort. That's generous of him, considering he almost joined them. Mr. Foster understands something that Dorothy Walsh and Richard Kellerman never did. That truth has a way of surviving attempts to suppress it. You can kill researchers, burn books, destroy records, but the truth remains, waiting to be rediscovered by the next curious mind." The phone rang. It was Inspector Kramer, and he sounded almost cheerful, which for Kramer meant he wasn't actively cursing. Goodwin, tell Wolf the DA's offering Dorothy Walsh a deal. Life in prison instead of death penalty if she gives up everyone else involved in the property fraud scheme. Turns out the Kellermans weren't the only family profiting from stolen properties. Many others, at least 6 that we know of, maybe more. Dorothy's singing like a canary now that she realizes she's not as clever as she thought. Amazing what the prospect of execution does to people's loyalty. Will the properties be returned? Some of them. Others have been sold so many times theirs, no clear original owner to return them to. But the fraud's exposed, the thieves are being prosecuted, and at least the truth is finally public. That's something. I hung up and reported to Wolf. He listened with his eyes closed, then said, "Justice is messy, Archie. Even when we catch the criminals, even when truth prevails, the damage can't always be undone. For researchers died because they asked questions. A 5th was nearly killed for the same reason. Thomas Morrison died trying to avenge his mother. Richard Kellerman died because his accomplice decided he was a liability. 6 deaths, all because Samuel Kellerman decided, 25 years ago, that stealing property was preferable to earning money honestly. At least Dorothy Walsh won't kill anyone else. No, but there will be others like her. People who value secrets over lives, who kill to protect old crimes, who believe that murder is somehow less terrible than revelation." He opened his eyes. "That's why libraries matter, Archie. That's why researchers matter. They're the antidote to enforced forgetting. They're the people who refuse to let truth stay buried simply because it's convenient for criminals." Very philosophical for a Thursday morning. I'm entitled to philosophy occasionally. I've just prevented a 6th murder, exposed a decades-old property fraud, stopped a library from becoming a death trap. I think that earns me at least 15 minutes of philosophical reflection before returning to more practical matters. What? Like whether Fritz's cassoulet tonight will be as good as last week's. Like whether my Phalaenopsis orchids will bloom on schedule. Like whether the world will leave me alone long enough to finish my book about Byzantine architecture. He picked up his coffee. The small things, Archie. The things that make life tolerable, despite humanity's persistent tendency toward murder, fraud, and general incompetence. Speaking of incompetence, what's our bank balance? Sufficient? Margaret Fletcher's check cleared, and she's arranged to pay the balance in monthly installments. We can afford to be idle for another month, possibly. 2, if we're frugal. You're never frugal. True. Then we can afford to be idle for another 3 weeks, at which point you'll need to find us another client. And I'll need to endure another interruption to my peaceful existence. You love it. I tolerate it. There's a difference. Stood up, which meant he was heading to the plant rooms for his morning session with the orchids. Archie, do me a favor. What? If anyone calls about a case involving libraries, books, or historical research, tell them I'm unavailable. How long? Indefinitely. I've had enough of literary murders for 1 year. He paused at the door. Though if someone calls about a particularly interesting case involving orchids or gourmet food, you may disturb me. Those are the only acceptable interruptions. Got it. Orchids and food? Yes. Libraries and murder? No. Precisely. He went upstairs, leaving me alone with the newspaper and my thoughts. I looked at the article about the library donations, the property seizures, the researchers who died. Then I looked at the case file sitting on my desk, neatly organized, properly documented, ready to be filed away as another successful investigation. The library that knew too much, except it wasn't the library that knew anything. It was the people who used it, people who asked questions, sought truth, refused to accept that some secrets should stay buried. They'd paid for that curiosity with their lives, but in the end, truth had won. The fraud was exposed, the killers caught, the stolen properties being returned. It wasn't perfect justice, for people were still dead. Nothing would bring them back, but it was something. A small victory in the endless war between truth and those who'd suppress it. I filed the case, updated our records, and went to help Fritz with lunch preparation. Somewhere in New York, researchers were checking out library books, pursuing knowledge, asking uncomfortable questions. And somewhere in the brownstone on West 35th Street, Nero Wolfe was tending his orchids and pretending he didn't care about any of it. But he did care. He cared enough to solve the case, expose the killers, prevent a sixth death. He just wouldn't admit it, because admitting he cared about humanity would interfere with his carefully constructed image of misanthropic genius who tolerated people only when they paid him. I smiled and went to the kitchen. Fritz was making duck à l'orange, and the smell alone was worth tolerating Wolf's philosophical moods and occasional outbursts of actual concern for his fellow humans. Some things, I decided, were worth remembering, like the case we'd just solved, like the researchers who died seeking truth, like Margaret Fletcher's determination to protect knowledge, even when knowledge was dangerous, the art of memory. Indeed, some memories were worth preserving, especially when others wanted them forgotten. The end.